1940, as the Nazi army overruns Europe, Hitler secretly attempts to keep America out of the war.
This story is explosive. The Nazis spent millions of dollars trying to influence the 1940 election and defeat FDR.
What motivated the Nazis to keep President Roosevelt from being re-elected?
He saw Hitler and the Nazis for the threat that they were.
Why did so many prominent Americans, like aviator Charles Lindbergh, want to appease Hitler?
He would say, look, the Germans are all powerful. You can't possibly compete with them.
And how close did the Nazis come to rigging an American election and changing the outcome of World War II?
The election was so close that maybe just a thumb on the scale would make all the difference.
History may be more shocking than we ever imagined. Today, technology forces the past to give up its secrets. Newly discovered documents turn history on its head, and discoveries in ancient archives reveal startling stories we never knew. While investigating American supporters of Adolf Hitler, historian Bradley Hart makes a shocking discovery.
So there's been a lot of discussion after the 2016 election about foreign actors interfering in US elections. As I was researching my book about the Nazis, I wondered whether they had ever tried something like this. And then I just came across this incredible story.
A Nazi-American conspiracy to rig a presidential election.
It appears that millions of dollars were spent trying to throw the 1940 presidential election against FDR. I realized that there was a story here that could potentially have relevance for our politics today.
It's late 1939 when Adolf Hitler starts World War II. A little over 1 year before the 1940 US presidential election. What to do about Hitler's war is the single biggest issue in the race. Most Americans don't want to get involved.
And all our efforts should be made to keep out of the fight. I think we should stay out of it entirely.
It's an extremely divisive time in America. Fertile ground for powerful forces to influence an election. Into this moment steps one of the biggest celebrities of the century, a man with millions of followers. Charles Lindbergh. The first man to fly solo across the Atlantic, Lindbergh is impressed by Hitler and the Nazis. Lindbergh is not alone. Homegrown Nazi groups like the German-American Bund openly celebrate Nazism on US soil.
Tens of thousands of German Americans join this organization. They're giving the Hitler salute, they're singing songs about how great the Fuhrer is.
They were happy to dress up in uniforms, they were happy to set up camps for children. It gave them a sense of destiny.
Bradley discovers Hitler's American election plot buried in an obscure US government report under the heading, "The Biggest Single Scheme." The first hint of the scheme surfaces in Nuremberg, as Nazi leaders are being tried for war crimes. Special Assistant to the US Attorney General John Rogge interrogates German Field Marshal Hermann Goering, head of the German Air Force, or Luftwaffe. He's the second most powerful Nazi, Hitler's number 2.
Trying to influence the 1940 presidential election.
Goering confirms that he created a slush fund to remove Franklin Roosevelt as president.
Goering says, well, of course I would have tried to influence the election. So not only is Goering not denying the allegation, he's openly bragging about it.
But the plot isn't Goering's creation. It's the brainchild of an American, an oil tycoon named William R. Davis.
Rogge is shocked, but knows that he has to dig in further. After that meeting with Goering, he actually goes out and tries to find the other key players of this plot.
Originally submitted in 1946, the explosive Rogge report is kept hidden from the public for years.
So the main question for me was just how deep did this plot go?
Hart starts his quest seeking details about the mysterious oil man, William R. Davis.
William Davis grows up in Alabama and in 1913 decides that he's going to go to Muskogee, Oklahoma, where oil has been discovered.
For close to 20 years, oil speculator Davis experiences a series of booms and busts, but mostly busts.
Always taking high risks to not just make it rich, but to expand his own empire. He not just sold himself, but in many ways convinced himself that he was someone destined for greatness.
Dreaming of becoming the next Rockefeller, in 1933, Davis identifies a highly motivated buyer for oil, Adolf Hitler.
In Germany, Davis recognizes there's great possibility here to make deals that more cautious oil companies would not be willing to make.
In the mid-1930s, Davis ships thousands of barrels of crude from the US and Mexico to a refinery he restores in Hamburg.
If he can convince German authorities that he is the man that can make their military run, then he is going to achieve a status that was unimaginable years before.
As Davis imports oil, he receives favored treatment by his Nazi paymaster, Hermann Goering. A son of America's segregated South, Davis seems to embrace the Nazi worldwide goal of Aryan superiority.
Davis has in his DNA a belief in white supremacy, and so it's no wonder that he's going to feel quite comfortable moving in the elite circles of Nazi Germany.
Goering also seeks the favor of another American influencer.
Lindbergh was the ideal national hero. He wrote American history. His record was 3,600 miles in 33.5 hours. The world now is at his feet.
In 1936, Hermann Goering hosts world-famous pilot Charles Lindbergh so he can review the German Luftwaffe.
Charles Lindbergh enjoyed the attention that the Germans offered him because he was obsessed with aviation. And Lindbergh saw nothing particularly wrong with Nazism.
Goering wants Lindbergh's assessment of the Nazi war machine to reach the entire world.
Goering was determined to charm Charles Lindbergh so that he would go out and say to the United States, to other Western countries, look, the Germans are all powerful. You can't possibly compete with them. It worked. The ploy worked.
The doctrine that we must enter the wars of Europe in order to defend America will be fatal to our nation if we follow it.
In the summer of 1936, Franklin Roosevelt accepts his party's nomination to serve as president for a second term. Flush with Nazi oil profits, William R. Davis, eager to gain influence and access to power, quietly donates nearly $400,000.
He's going to start funneling money in hopes of winning favor with Democratic leadership and with Franklin D. Roosevelt himself.
A new U.S. pollster named George Gallup predicts an FDR election victory.
Leading up to the 1936 presidential election, Gallup had President Roosevelt at 56% approval. He ended up winning that election with 61% of the vote.
An unpleasant duty.
Following Roosevelt's 1936 landslide victory, top donor Davis receives a signed photograph from FDR.
What Davis has done is ingratiate himself to the White House in a very real way.
During this time, Davis gains access to another powerful figure in Washington, Union leader John L. Lewis. Lewis leads the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO, a powerful association of 8 labor unions representing mass production industries, including oil workers. In March 1938, Mexico's president seizes the nation's oil fields, responding to labor abuses by outside big oil companies like Shell and Standard, creating an opening for William Davis. He steps in to make the deal of a lifetime with the help of John Lewis's oil union endorsement.
I need you to call the Mexican labor leader you're close with. I understand he has President Cardena's ear.
In June 1938, the Mexican government negotiates with William Davis to become their top exporter of oil. His top customer? Nazi Germany.
March 18, 1938, Mexico nationalized.
To learn more about Davis's Mexican oil deal, Bradley Hart meets with oil historian Darren Dochuk and animator Edmund Earl.
So Darren, in 1938, when these Mexican oil fields are appropriated, where exactly are they?
Edmund, if you would like to just pull in and focus more on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, this is the heart of oil country. Davis is able to strike a deal, a very profitable, lucrative deal with the Mexican government, whereby he promises to purchase $10 million worth of Mexican oil. He's going to ship it to a very desperate buyer, Germany.
Mexico's a long way off, so why is Germany relying on Mexico for its oil?
Germany is quite hemmed in here. It is not an oil-producing nation, and so it has to look for alternatives.
In 1938, Davis signs the contract to be Mexico's leading exporter of oil.
By September of 1939, some 30% of all oil supplies refined in Germany and made available to Germany will be Davis's Mexican crude.
But on September 1st, 1939, Davis's sweetheart deal gets turned upside down.
September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland.
2 days later, Great Britain and France declare war on Germany.
The sparring is ended. World War II has begun.
Having exported Mexican oil to the Nazis for more than a year, Davis's bright future abruptly goes dark. And his top political friend, President Franklin Roosevelt, is about to become his worst enemy. Author Bradley Hart discovers a secret Nazi-American plot to meddle in the 1940 presidential election. In 1939, American conspirator William R. Davis, supplying oil to the Nazis, now faces financial ruin if the war in Europe continues and the Allies block his shipments.
The realization that the operation might be up was absolutely devastating to Davis. He was forced by his contract with Mexico to continue to sell Mexican oil, no matter the circumstances.
As Britain and France fight Germany, many Americans, like William Davis, are staunchly opposed to U.S. intervention. Remembering the cost of World War I, the U.S. public wants to stay out of World War II, an attitude called isolationism.
This time America should keep out, and I know I will. But you know, fight our own battles. They mean nothing to us.
American hero Charles Lindbergh steps up to be their voice.
Lindbergh had been preaching for years against the idea of America going to war.
And I have been forced to the conclusion that we cannot win this war for England, regardless of how much assistance we send. I believe...
When he went before the microphone, it set off this amazing reaction. Thousands of people said, "You're right."
As Lindbergh preaches appeasement with Hitler, a German-American group, the Bund, emulates the Nazis on U.S. soil.
There was a German fascist presence in the United States in the 1930s who admired what Hitler was doing in Germany. There was a strong anti-immigration feeling. The idea outsiders were coming in. There was a great sense of we've got to keep our country pure.
In 1939, the German Bund holds a contentious rally in New York's Madison Square Garden.
What's really disturbing about the Bund is that they're trying to sell the idea that Nazism and Americanism are completely compatible with one another. Their symbolism is literally the swastika combined with the American flag. At their largest rally in 1939, they have a large portrait of George Washington behind the stage.
Bund leader Fritz Kuhn gives an impassioned speech to his fellow American Nazis.
What we are actively fighting for, first, a social, just, white, Gentile, ruled United States.
Fritz Kuhn actually says that if George Washington were alive today, he would certainly be a fascist.
There wasn't any doubt that this was Nazism come to the United States. And although the numbers were very small, they actually managed to cause an enormous rumpus.
Now, in the waning days of his second term, the once popular President Roosevelt faces tremendous upheaval, both at home and abroad.
By November of 1938, the Democrats had lost seats in the House and the Senate. President Roosevelt's approval rating had sunk to a low of 46%.
Roosevelt had suffered some severe political defeats, which made him very cautious over what we should be doing in Europe. It did make him very, very nervous about doing anything that might inflame the isolationist feeling in this country, which was overwhelming.
Desperate to restart his oil trade with Germany, isolationist and top FDR donor William R. Davis devises an audacious plan to stop the European war.
If peace cannot be reestablished in Europe, he will be the man to make peace. He's not doing this out of kind motives. He's doing this because his entire fortune is at stake.
So Davis asks his politically connected friend, Union leader John Lewis, for a favor.
John Lewis calls Roosevelt and asks him to meet secretly with his friend William Davis.
To investigate the details of Davis's private meeting with FDR, Bradley Hart meets with presidential historian Lindsay Chervinsky at the White House Ellipse.
John Lewis was a very important figure in the labor movement, and so he was able to get a meeting for his friend, William Davis.
2 weeks after Germany invades Poland, FDR agrees to meet with William Davis, along with Assistant Secretary of State Adolph Burley, upstairs at the White House.
Roosevelt actually preferred to hold most of his personal meetings in the Oval Drawing Room, which is on the second floor of the White House.
I understood this was to be a private conversation between you and me.
Adolph's all right.
FDR invited Adolph Burley to be there, so there was perhaps a witness or a record.
Lindsay shows Bradley a copy of Burley's private notes from the Roosevelt-Davis meeting on September 15, 1939.
Goering is in effect the government of Germany.
Convinced of his own importance, Davis believes he has the power to broker a European peace directly with the Nazis.
It was typical of Davis to think that he could concoct an audacious plan for peace. This is someone who viewed himself in prophetic terms, destined by God to literally transform the world.
Roosevelt indulges his brazen donor's desire, but FDR couches his support.
Davis could feel free to pursue a peace agreement, but Roosevelt couldn't commit to it until it officially came through government channels. Roosevelt was happy for people to pursue projects as long as they didn't make it seem like they were pursuing it on behalf of the president.
Following his White House meeting, Davis leaves for Germany to discuss peace terms with Hitler's second-in-command, Field Marshal Hermann Goering.
He indicates to Goering that Roosevelt is indeed warm to the idea of peace.
Over 4 days of talks in early October, Goering lays out his terms.
The only peace we'll accept will allow us to keep our NATO plans, and that our brave...
Goering's terms are essentially Czechoslovakia would become Nazi territory indefinitely, most of Poland would become Nazi territory, Germany would get dominion over the East and leave the French and British empires alone in the West.
Within days of the completed peace talks, Davis sends a personal letter to the White House detailing Goering's terms. At Hart's request, DC-based researcher and archivist Hilary Bergen retrieves some key documents from the FDR Presidential Library in New York.
The first one I have here is a letter written by William Rhodes Davis to FDR on October 11th, 1939.
This is actually from Davis to the president.
This is from Davis to the president.
It's incredible.
This letter details in 12 pages his meeting with Field Marshal Goering in Berlin in early October.
Poring over the letter, Hart realizes Davis didn't keep his promise to remain a neutral arbiter.
And he says the Field Marshal requested again, so he means Goering, that I confirm to him his understanding that my statements were made at Mr. Roosevelt's request.
Ooh.
So Davis is saying here that he's representing the President of the United States.
Yes.
And we know that that's exactly what Roosevelt asked him not to do.
Exactly.
Also sourced from the FDR library, Bergen gives Hart a translated copy of the German notes from the peace talks, recorded by a top Goering aide, Helmut Wohlthat.
When we see the German notes, there's this real disconnect between what Davis is telling FDR and what he actually tells the Germans.
In the German notes, Davis falsely claims FDR objected to Britain's premature declaration of war.
He doesn't want to support another war with England. FDR feels...
The Germans seem to have taken Davis at face value. I think there's also an element here of what do you have to lose? Maybe Davis can deliver what he promised.
On October 16, 1939, Secretary Adolph Burley reveals Davis's overreach to FDR.
Davis wholly misrepresented himself as your negotiator.
Roosevelt is really furious because he had given pretty explicit instructions about what Davis was not allowed to say, and Davis blew right past those restrictions.
FDR is uncharacteristically outraged. The quote from one of his confidants is that he, quote, hit the roof.
Cut him off, and no more access to the White House.
Burley will inform Davis his Nazi peace deal is, for all intents and purposes, dead.
The message that Burley is sending to Davis is stop trying to mess around with things that are well out of your depth here. Stick to the oil business, leave international diplomacy to the professionals.
His oil business crippled by the blockade, and now rejected by FDR, William R. Davis begins forming a new plan to remove Franklin Roosevelt from office with the Nazis' help. While investigating the German-American conspiracy to rig the 1940 U.S. presidential election, historian Bradley Hart shifts his focus back to the Nazi plotters and their recorded confessions while incarcerated as war criminals.
The oil was embargoed by
In 1946, U.S. interrogator John Rogge interviews a protege of Field Marshal Hermann Goering, Dr. Joachim Herzlet.
Field Marshal assigned me to Mr. Davis.
Dr. Herzlet was the Nazi liaison for business dealings with U.S. oil man William R. Davis.
When Davis negotiated the deal with Mexico, I assisted his efforts.
Go ahead, Herzlet. Tell me about the attempt to influence the 1940 election.
Herzlet explains Davis fumed over his failure to negotiate peace with FDR and restart his Mexican oil shipments.
For Davis, this is a grievous insult. He's helped the president win re-election. He's been, in his mind, a loyal supporter. Davis cannot let this insult stand. If Roosevelt can't be counted on to make peace, then Roosevelt would have to be replaced.
Davis reaches out to his Nazi handler Herzlet to propose a plot to force FDR from office.
I think the Field Marshal would be very interested.
Davis tells Herzlet that Union boss and CIO leader John L. Lewis holds the key to FDR's re-election hopes because he could personally deliver millions of Union votes.
John L. Lewis is a key ally for anyone in Washington, D.C., especially those involved with the Democratic Party. This is a guy who can make or break candidates.
With Lewis's help, Davis plans to secretly buy political influence should the president seek a third term. So the oil man asks the Nazis for a large donation to fuel his covert efforts.
Let me speak with him and get back to you.
He pitches this to Herzl, and Goering is very enthusiastic about this plan. Getting rid of FDR would be a massive reassurance that the U.S. is not likely to go into the war.
Few in democratic politics, including Roosevelt, dare challenge Lewis's political muscle as head of the CIO. But secretly, FDR discusses ways to aid the Allied forces and even reinstate the draft to prepare for war, which Lewis strongly opposes.
Lewis is concerned about the impact that conscription would have on Union membership. In a wartime situation, Lewis is afraid that labor's rights will simply be crushed.
Fearful FDR will lead America into World War II, John L. Lewis calls on Adolf Early to see if he can personally rescue the Goering-Davis peace plan.
So Lewis knows about Roosevelt's rejection of the peace plan from Davis. And so Lewis then goes to Adolf Early and says, why won't Roosevelt take the Goering peace plan? Germany's willing to negotiate. What's the problem here?
Do you mean the president isn't interested in peace?
Germany has a thoroughly competent representative in Washington who can convey messages of this character.
October 1939. As Hitler's Nazi army conquers most of Poland, isolationist fever is heating up across America. Bradley Hart visits the Gallup World Headquarters in Washington, D.C. to meet with Editor-in-Chief Muhammad Yunus. He wants to learn how Gallup tracked American public opinion leading up to the 1940 presidential election.
So what was polling methodology like in the 1930s? How was Gallup actually doing these polls?
That's a great question. We actually, as we do today...
Muhammad explains that in 1935, Dr. George Gallup, founder of the American Institute of Public Opinion, pioneered a new targeted method to gather data.
Dr. Gallup's approach was based on demographic information, based on population density, based on educational attainment and others. Statistical tests continue to prove that really 1,000 or 1,500 respondents is the sweet spot. It's actually the number we still use today.
So George Gallup's genius really was in figuring out a way to do sampling with fewer respondents to project to the larger population.
So less work, but more accurate results.
Exactly.
Muhammad wants to show Bradley just how modern Gallup polling compares to the door-to-door method of the 1930s.
Hello, this is Bradley calling for the Gallup poll. We're doing our latest...
Working with a laptop and telephone headset, Bradley conducts his first Gallup poll.
Right now, do you think that economic conditions in the country as a whole are getting better or getting worse?
Dr. Gallup did feel that effective leaders needed to understand public opinion effectively in order to serve their constituencies. He would say, quote, "If democracy is about the will of the people, somebody should go out and find what that will is," end quote.
So how do policymakers respond to having all this new data at their fingertips?
It became a mainstay of American politics to this day in terms of where do the people actually stand.
Weeks after Allied forces began fighting Germany, Gallup polling indicates Americans feel strongly about one issue: staying out of Hitler's war. With the American public growing increasingly worried about the future, Roosevelt appears to be a vulnerable candidate in 1940. So Davis, Lewis, and the Nazi Herzl meet secretly to discuss ways to deny the president a third term.
The money's being delivered through an Italian friend that has access to...
Based on the U.S. Justice report outlining the election interference scheme, Goering approves $5 million to fund their efforts.
In March of 1940, all three of them together frame kind of the contours of this plan. They're going to pour this $5 million dispersed in many different ways, and that's going to propagate this settled pro-German anti-intervention agenda.
Now let's see what the president decides to do.
Most Americans strongly oppose any attempt to support the Allies in their fight against Hitler. So Davis, Lewis, and their Nazi friends see an opportunity to defeat FDR. In March of 1940, as the American and Nazi conspirators plot to interfere with the US presidential election, a courier delivers a large package to the German embassy in Washington, D.C. The Rogge report indicates Dr. Joachim Herzlitt receives $5 million cash from Hermann Goering. Days later, the Nazi agent personally hands U.S. co-conspirator William R. Davis a substantial portion of Goering's slush fund.
So Herzlitt literally hands Davis a bag full of cash. Davis then takes this money, visits 4 different banks where he puts this money into different accounts. What Davis is doing here is covering his tracks.
On May 10, 1940, Hitler orders the Nazi army into France. This brazen act triggers President Franklin Roosevelt to pursue an unprecedented third term.
He thought that he was the only one that could lead this country at a time when it was becoming more and more clear that we were probably going to have to get involved in the war.
There weren't really any other people in the Democratic Party with enough gravitas, with enough experience to step into his shoes.
The Germans got a little bit closer.
With Bradley Hart, historians Lynn Olson, Nicholas Wapshott, and Lindsay Chervinsky discuss the shift in U.S. public opinion.
When the Germans crossed over into France, when they marched into Paris, that's when it hit home for Americans.
It wasn't until they saw the pictures of German troops marching by the Arc de Triomphe up and down the Champs-Élysées that it suddenly hit home. This is getting real.
What do most Americans think about the idea of sending troops into France as they did in 1917?
Americans look back at World War I as a catastrophe for this country. I mean, this was going to be the war to end all wars, and instead we get Adolf Hitler almost immediately.
Certainly people did not want to send American troops to Europe. People really drew a distinction between sending troops and aiding the Allies.
Following George Washington's example, no U.S. president had ever served more than 2 terms. By breaking this tradition, FDR rouses his Republican adversaries.
Roosevelt, using the argument, in order to prevent the dictators in Europe from winning, you should elect me. The Republicans said, no, if we elect you, you will become a dictator.
In late June 1940, the Republicans nominate Wendell Willkie to be their presidential candidate.
They actually accused Roosevelt of warmongering, saying that he was going to get our American boys into the war. It was a nasty, nasty campaign on both sides.
His promise to keep our boys out of foreign wars is no better than his promise to balance the budget. They're already almost on the transport.
When Roosevelt accepts the Democratic nomination in July, he's barely polling ahead of Willkie, 48% to 42% nationally.
Roosevelt was only 6 points ahead of Willkie, which is a relative weak point for him. But by then, 6 in 10 Americans actually wanted to see the U.S. stay out of the war in Europe.
With the election approaching, Hart's research suggests Davis began funneling Nazi money to pro-isolationist politicians and causes. But hard evidence remains elusive.
Davis would distribute money in back channels secretly and through different bank accounts, operating as Davis was known to do in the dark.
As Election Day nears, President Roosevelt faces not only a well-funded Nazi interference campaign, but a popular American movement. 2 months before the election, a national anti-war committee is formed to publicly champion the U.S. isolationist cause, America First. Their headline speaker, Charles Lindbergh.
We ask you to join the America First Committee in its stand.
He wasn't running America First, but he became the mouthpiece,
One way that Lindbergh got his message across to them was to describe how easily the German war machine destroys its enemies. We don't want to be on the other side of that. And he was spelling it out to them. Don't go down that road. It's death and disaster.
With most Americans reluctant to confront Hitler, leading up to the 1940 election, Roosevelt must publicly stake out his own isolationist position.
The opinion polls through 1940 were slowly drifting towards his point of view, that it was inevitable that America would join a war against Nazism. Still, the majority of people were anxious about their sons being killed. And so he was obliged to say, repeatedly, I've said it again and again.
And again, your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign war.
In the final days of the campaign, with the presidential race neck and neck, oil man William R. Davis blindsides FDR by financing an October surprise.
Davis would provide the funds, $55,000, to pay radio stations to broadcast in a 30-minute message.
The speaker? CIO union leader and former FDR ally, John L. Lewis.
I address all Americans. Our country is at one of the crossroads of its political destiny.
What Lewis and Davis considered the potentially crowning achievement of this entire operation was for Lewis to come out publicly against Franklin D. Roosevelt. He would ask supporters, especially in labor unions, to throw their support behind the Republican Wendell Willkie.
The foregoing statement constitutes the first basis of my personal opposition to the re-election of President Roosevelt for a third term as Chief Executive of the Republic.
John L. Lewis felt betrayed, and the response was a vindictiveness against Franklin Roosevelt. His October surprise speech was a perfect example of someone who knew the election was so close that maybe just a thumb on the scale would make all the difference.
At the end of the address, John L. Lewis lobs out a bombshell. He tells working men and women that if FDR is re-elected in 1940, he will resign immediately as head of the CIO. By turning against Roosevelt less than 2 weeks before the 1940 election, this is the ultimate payback.
With the French defeated and Nazi bombs now falling on Great Britain, the world waits to see if Franklin Roosevelt will remain president, or if the Nazi-financed election plot tips America towards appeasement with Hitler. On November 5th, 1940, the world anxiously awaits the outcome of the U.S. presidential election between Republican Wendell Willkie and the Democratic president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Perhaps the most nervous observer is FDR himself.
The polls actually got quite close. They were at one point within 5 points, which any pollster will tell you is within the margin of error.
Oil man William R. Davis and labor leader John L. Lewis believe millions of union members will answer Lewis's call to vote for Willkie, casting FDR out of office and giving Hitler a huge victory.
If union membership really is as monolithic as Lewis is representing it, and they do vote against FDR, the election may well be lost.
As the vote is tallied nationwide, tensions run high at the White House.
Roosevelt seemed to think that there was a good chance that he would not win. He told everybody to go away. He went into his office and he shut the door.
When the ballots cast that historic election day were tabulated, it was found that some 22 million had given to Mr. Willkie the largest popular vote ever received by a losing candidate for the presidency. But the electoral vote was a different matter.
Roosevelt, having far surpassed pollsters' predictions, celebrates his third-term election victory.
The final margin would be 10 percentage points between Roosevelt and Willkie. This is a really smashing victory for FDR.
Despite their well-financed attempt to rig the 1940 election, the Nazi co-conspirators failed miserably.
When news came through that Franklin Roosevelt had triumphed, Churchill was delighted. He said to one of his cabinet colleagues, "So we won the war after all."
Following Roosevelt's election victory, Nazi co-conspirators John L. Lewis and William R. Davis are both left utterly defeated.
Lewis had promised that should Roosevelt win another term, that he would step down as head of the CIO. And in the wake of Roosevelt's re-election, he would indeed step down. This commanding figure now succumbs to his own kind of political maneuvers.
William Rhodes Davis never gives up on trying to keep Roosevelt from entering World War II. But Davis and Lewis are essentially politically ruined. There's not a lot of options for either to make a comeback at this point.
Hart's investigation reveals a startling and forgotten story. But he's still missing one critical piece.
We have plenty of evidence that the Davis and Goering election interference plot took place. What we don't have is the exact paper trail as to what happened with the money. Davis was very good at covering his tracks.
So Bradley, I've done some more research.
Still collaborating with Hart, researcher and archivist Hilary Bergen ultimately finds the Davis needle within the Nazi haystack.
So the US and the Allies, after the war is over, have retrieved millions and millions of documents from Nazi archives.
These were German Foreign Ministry communiques to various embassies and agents, actually all over the world. And they shed huge amounts of light on what the Germans had been up to during the war.
So I want you to take a look at this one telegram from July 5th, 1940.
So this is a telegram to Herzlitt saying that Mr. Davis has paid $250,000 to the National and Pennsylvania State Democratic Organizations, and then requesting an explanation.
Berlin demands confirmation Davis bought delegate votes at the 1940 Democratic Convention. Then, Hillary shows Bradley the reply from Davis's Nazi handler, Dr. Joachim Herzlitt. He confirms the bribe.
Says that your information is correct for the purpose of buying the approximately 40 Pennsylvania delegates to vote against Roosevelt. This is Herzlitt saying Davis has spent the money to try to influence the 1940 election. This is the paper trail.
Exactly.
These documents give us unequivocal proof that Herzlitt was not only receiving the money from Berlin and transmitting it to Davis, but that he was keeping Berlin closely apprised as Davis's plot unfolded. These documents are the smoking gun for an event designed to take place in the shadows.
Having tried to buy politicians and sway the U.S. electorate, Goering's $5 million couldn't fix the results. But realistically, could the Nazis have ever swung the 1940 election against Roosevelt?
The Germans, for all their vaunted military superiority, were horrific in terms of propaganda aimed at the United States. They didn't know how to do it. They were awful at it. The American people were very anti-Nazi, very anti-Hitler. The Germans could have spent all the money in the world and it wouldn't have made any difference.
Does history suggest that America can ever be free from foreign election influence?
As long as there have been elections, there has been interference in one way or another.
I think it's priced in by now. But the War of Independence, the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, each of these are to do with establishing that it's our vote that counts, and it's not up to other people to try to sway us one way or another. When people just wave it away, I think that they're doing democracy an enormous disservice.